and welcome to a bonus podcast from Scottish Independence Podcasts to mark the passing of Elspeth King.
I was quite sad to hear of the death of Elspeth King this week. She died on the 1st of November. The first time I heard her speaking was 5 years ago. It was at a Pensioners for Independence Zoom chat because we were all in lockdown, and Mary McCabe of Glasgow Pensioners for India asked Elspeth to come and talk to us about history and the role of history in society and, you know, and the power of history. And I just remember it as being such a fantastic talk. It was just amazing. So we broadcast that talk originally when it came out, but we thought we'd rebroadcast it just now, just to commemorate Elspeth. She was a curator of social history at the People's Palace in Glasgow, and then later on she was director of the Stirling Smith Museum in Stirling. Had you come across her in Women for Indie?
Not that I remember. She was a member of Women for Indie, but my first exposure as well was that Pensioners for Indie talk. I remember hearing it at the time, and I've just tidied it up to rebroadcast it and just check nothing was out of date. And actually, it's as relevant and as timely now as it was 5 years ago when she first gave it. And some of the concepts she mentions there are actually more relevant today. For example, she used a phrase, internal colonialism. That would have just skipped over us, I think, 5 years ago, but now it's got much more significance because of the work that Liberation.Scot are doing. And she also talked about just the power of history, certain exhibitions that she'd put on to coincide with, you know, the Stirling Bridge anniversary, the Bannockburn 700 anniversary, and what have you. Just fascinating to hear her describe what a dreadful state the teaching of Scottish history has been. And she's quite upfront about what she experienced when she tried to study history as a student.
That was what struck in my mind, actually, from the talk. When she described exactly that, when she was, you know, went as an undergraduate to St Andrews and said that she wanted to study Scottish history, and then the response to that. So that's part and parcel of the talk. And as you say, it hasn't dated, but then maybe history doesn't date.
Well, maybe it's far enough back that it hasn't. There was a great bit in it, something I just thought was really funny when she said she was talking about the Battle of Stirling Bridge, which was the 11th of September. And she said, was it any coincidence that was the date of the vote to establish the Scottish Parliament? And did Donald Dewar realise that? And the person she was speaking to said, I wouldn't have thought so. Said it would just have been a Thursday.
Yes, that's true. Anyway, we hope you enjoy listening to this talk. And
it's a tribute to Elspeth. And just listening to her speak now, as happens with a lot of people, it just makes you aware of what a loss she is to the movement. And there's yet another warrior who didn't live long enough to see the glorious day that she's been fighting for. So this is a tribute to Elspeth. Thank you for everything you did.
Yeah, thank you, Elspeth.
This is the talk that Elspeth gave on the 31st of July 2020.
Now, Mary's asked me to talk about the importance of Scottish history to the independence cause, the anniversaries of significance this year, and also to say something about the current fashion for statue bashing, which has come in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. So I'm going to try and cover things relating to that. But straight away, I'm going to lay my cards on the table and tell you where I'm coming from. I'm not a historian, and I lay no claim to any impartiality in what I say or do. I'm also not a member of any political party, but I'm a lifelong nationalist and a member of Women for Indie. In my working life, I've been a museum curator for 45 years, a year in Kelvin Grove, 17 years in the People's Palace, 3 in Abbott House, Dunfermline, and the last 24 at the Stirling Smith Art Gallery and Museum in Stirling. And I've come across a lot of prejudice against the history that's been my good fortune to interpret during my working life, and this in turn has shaped my own partialities and prejudices. Now, it's my belief that those who know and write about the past can understand the present and shape the future, and I know myself that the cause of independence has been held back by the failure to teach Scottish history, literature and language in our schools. We've long suffered from what is known as internal colonialism and the well-documented Scottish cringe, whereby all of our culture is regarded as inferior to that of our bigger southern neighbour. At my school in Cowdenbeath in the 1960s, we were taught Scottish history for the higher exams. The course was based on the 3-volume Scottish history by Ian MacPhail, head of history at Clydebank High School. MacPhail wrote his books in 1954 and 61 because he couldn't get any suitable textbooks at that time. And I greatly enjoyed this MacPhail-based course, but on my very first day at the University of St Andrews, I learnt from fellow students that Scottish history was not a recognised subject for the purposes of a degree. I was told that Scottish history was too parochial and narrow a subject for study, and it wasn't just the students who believed this, we got it from the lecturers as well. Because no one in St Andrews in the 1960s could study Scottish history except as a special subject in the second year only, and there was no reading list. You had to go out and find the books for yourself. My degree was in medieval history, taught mainly by teachers from Oxbridge, who to students who had failed to get into Oxbridge and who looked upon St Andrews as the third best university. A main feature of the course was the work of William Stubbs, Bishop of Oxford, on English constitutional documents. And to get as far away from that as possible, I chose to specialise in medieval history of Scandinavia in my final honours year. And this prejudice against Scottish history was just so blatant at that time. I know things have changed enormously since, but we've got a long way to go. Now, much later in 1993, I was invited to celebrate the appointment of one of my fellow students, Alan McInnes, to the Burnett Fletcher Chair of History in the University of Aberdeen. The celebration concerned the fact that Alan was the first Scot to be appointed to a chair of history in any of Scotland's universities since 1903. I said to Alan, that can't be right. And I started to name other professors that I knew. And indeed, some had had chairs of Scottish history in other Scottish universities. But Alan was correct. No Scot had held a chair of general history in any of Scotland's 5 universities in 90 years. What does that tell you about the cultural colonisation of our land, when no native Scot could be trusted with the teaching of history? Only English people were appointed to teach history in our universities, and most of them seemed to believe that Scottish history was not worthy of study in its own right. So it's no wonder that so little Scottish history was taught in our Scottish schools, and no wonder there's still problems in getting it on the curriculum. Well, subjects not on the curriculum became the feature of my working life for many years, as schools failed to visit because they were not doing the Wars of Independence, the Jacobites, or whatever themes we were engaged in addressing in the museum. Some subjects were not on the curriculum anywhere. With the exhibition of Scottish suffragettes in 1978, a large number of people seemed surprised there had been a suffrage movement in Scotland at all, thanks to all the books on the movements in London and Manchester, and TV programmes like Shoulder to Shoulder. 40 years later, in 2015, the film Suffragette did nothing to change the illusion of a London-based movement. Nothing happened in Scotland. The lack of a Scottish-owned and run television and film industry is another factor which works against stimulating interest in and the study of Scottish history. It's rare to find any programme of interest and credibility involving the dramatisation of any episode of Scottish history. In 1995, we had the film Braveheart, followed by a minor film on Robert the Bruce 23 years later in 2018. And there was a quite forgettable film on Mary Queen of Scots that year, which was following on from the Katharine Hepburn film of 1936 and the Vanessa Redgrave film of 1971, both of which were largely concerned about Mary's relationship to Elizabeth Tudor. Now, by contrast with this, when you look at Wikipedia, there's a 17-page list of films on Elizabeth I and a 19-page list of films on Henry VIII. That's just film. That doesn't include the wall-to-wall television programmes in the form of plays, documentaries, dramas and soaps, which on the Tudors, which seem to be on our TV screens on a permanent basis. And when there is a TV series in Scottish history, it often does more harm than good, like the 10-part BBC production in 2008, fronted by Neil Oliver, which had an Anglo-centric script, operating on the premise that Scotland was a divided and backward country until the union with England civilised us. And I see from last Sunday's programme, The Rise of the Clans, that Oliver is still hard at work at expounding this theory. Now, I've always been interested in the power of history to make history, and in my working life welcomed the opportunity to do commemorative exhibitions looking at the stories and significances of past events. In Stirling in 1997, I mounted a major exhibition on the Battle of Stirling Bridge for the 700th anniversary. It was one of the best ever exhibitions for attendance and visitor numbers, and I also managed to get a commercial publisher to sponsor the publication. And as a bonus that year, on the 11th of September 1997, the Scottish people voted for the reinstatement of the Scottish Parliament on the very day of the battle. And at that time, I thought it was prescient to Donald Dewar to choose the anniversary as the day of polling, and asked another politician of that ilk if this was a deliberate choice on the part of Dewar. And the answer was, good God, no. He'd never have dreamt of doing that. It would have been on a Thursday, just check the date. And indeed, it was a Thursday. And a few years later, Stirling's annual Happy Day became drowned out by the American tragedy we now know as 9/11. Needless to say, I was looking for a successful rerun with the 700th anniversary of the Battle of Bannockburn in 2014. Again, we had a big exhibition at the Stirling Smith, looking how the battle had been marked, reenacted, painted and celebrated over a 700-year period. But at this particular time, we had difficulties in the planning and delivery of the supporting programme of events. I had the usual programme of formal lectures and an event or two with Lord Bruce, which kept our local Tories happy. I also wanted to run a theatrical performance by the Dunfermline-based actor and Bruce reenactor Jock Ferguson, entitled Twa Declarations of Independence. Jock's idea was simply to dramatically present the Declaration of Arbroath 1320 in costume, and after the interval, the American Declaration of Independence, again in costume, 1776, followed by an audience discussion. Now, the chairman of the Smith Trustees, a former Labour provost of Stirling, was filled with horror at this idea and promised that this was too political and there would be funding cuts for the Smith if the session went ahead. And he demanded to see the script. And when we told him that the scripts were written in 1320 and 1776 and couldn't be changed, he was outwardly furious and highly unpleasant. And that's how important historical documents are. Maybe that's why we Scots can't be trusted to teach our own history, because anyone listening to a presentation of these documents cannot fail but to be moved by them. So, of course, for the sake of the organisation, I didn't run this session. That same chairman of the Smiths, by showing me who was in charge in 2014, organised an evening reception in the Smith for the Grandees of Armed Forces Day, held in Stirling to drown out the effects of Bannockburn 700. So we had to entertain the Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Carmichael, and his unionist military chums in the middle of the Battle of Bannockburn exhibition. This is how things are in a country where there's no political independence. Independent thought isn't allowed either, and how we look at and interpret our history is policed to make sure that people don't get overtly interested in or excited about it. Now, 2020, this year should have been a huge year of historical significance and celebration for Scotland, with the 700th anniversary of the Declaration of Arbroath and the 200th anniversary of the 1820 Rising. I was in Dublin for the centenary of the Easter Rising, and seeing how an independent country promotes its history is a lesson we've all got to have to learn. I'm sure there wasn't a person in Ireland who wasn't aware of the events of 1916 and their importance in the nation's history. And of course, these celebratory events were not just in Ireland, but in every country which has a population with Irish heritage. Now, if I was still in a job and there was no COVID-19, it would have given me the greatest pleasure to run an exhibition on Scottish governance, 1320 to 2020, this year. There is so much we should be looking at, talking about, understanding and discussing. The kernel of Scottish political thinking is contained in the Declaration of Arbroath, where, after great praise of the King, Robert the Bruce, the barons and churchmen declared their support with the proviso that, and I quote, "If he should give up that which he has begun and agree to make us or our kingdom subject to the King of the English, we should exert ourselves at once to drive him out as our enemy and as a subverter of his rights and ours, and to take some other man who is well able to defend us as king." Now, they're saying something quite revolutionary here. If the king doesn't protect the people, he will be no longer king. We will get somebody else with the right qualifications to do the job. Most of us know the sentence which follows: "For as long as 100 of us remain alive, etc., never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule." There's no time in this short session to go into the effects of minority rule in Scotland, but suffice to say the Scottish people never had the same reverence or even respect for the royal family as people from other European nations did, or indeed as the English do to this very day. And much of this is due to the actions of the great Scottish scholar and statesman George Buchanan, who lived between 1507 and 82. He's known as Scotland's Renaissance man and is the equivalent of Erasmus of Rotterdam. And it's shameful that so few people know and understand his work and influence. Every arts graduate from the University of Edinburgh, when capped with the ceremonial mortarboard, is touched by Buchanan as part of his clothing is sewn into the mortarboard. But Buchanan's touched us all. Even a century after his death, his books were still being ceremoniously burnt at the University of Oxford. That's how dangerous they were. Buchanan was born in Killearn, Stirlingshire. He was educated at the Sorbonne in Paris, was a teacher of James V's children in Stirling Castle, but had to flee because of his satirical writings against the Roman Catholic Church. He taught in many places in France, and on account of his plays, Jephthah and the Baptist, he is regarded as a founding father of classical French tragedy. He was court poet to King Francois II of France and his bride, Mary Queen of Scots. And he always described himself as George Buchanan of Scotland, in case anyone mistook him for being French. Most of his works are written in Renaissance Latin, and our tragedy is we don't have access to it today. Now, when King Francois, Mary Queen of Scots' husband, died, Buchanan followed Mary back to Scotland, where he became principal of St Leonard's College in St Andrews. But he also became Mary's enemy, as he was a believer in church reform and leader of the Scottish Reformation. He came to regard Mary as a tyrant and wrote the pamphlet which led to her deposition in Scotland. And he followed this up with his political treatise, De Jure Regni Apud Scotus, The Art and Science of Government Among the Scots, which was so anti-monarchist and against the English concept of the divine right of kings. It was the book that every English monarchist wanted to burn. But I remember in the 1970s, an edition of it was offered for sale in the Scots Independent just about every week. And it's sad that we no longer are paying the same attention to it as we once did. Now, after Mary was deposed, Buchanan had the personal tuition of the young King James VI in Stirling Castle, and he hammered home the concept of kingship as a contract between the king and the people, both literally and metaphorically. Now, as Keeper of the Privy Seal, Buchanan had an input into designing the coinage for the boy king, and the messages are unmistakable. If you look at the coins, just look them up on Google after this. The so-called sword dollar features a hand clutching a sword, and the inscription, pro me, si merior, in me, for me, but if I deserve it, in me. The gold coins have the legend, Salus Populi Suprema Lex, the safety of the people is the supreme law. Buchanan lifted this directly from Cicero, and it's been used in many countries in their coinage since. Buchanan was fiercely opposed to any notion of the divine right of kings. In practical terms, this is summed up in the story of the beatings he gave the young King James VI. On one occasion, the Countess of Mar, who was responsible for James's bodily welfare, was loudly complaining of what she called an attack on the King's majesty, and the young boy king was crying. And Buchanan turned to her and simply said, "Madam, I have scalped his erse. You may kiss it if you please." But when the Stuart dynasty moved to England, it embraced the whole concept of the divine right, with disastrous consequences for Scotland, where religion and politics had taken a totally different turn. Scotland was shaped by its Protestant Reformation. By contrast, England, where Henry VIII just needed a divorce, the Reformation was very different and more of a political convenience. Henry split from the Catholic Church, pocketed the church treasures, and declared himself head of the Church of England and defender of the faith. In Scotland, the church was largely beggared thanks to the Stuart kings already, and the Protestant Reformation was preached by a group of university-educated hitmen whose faith was based on the readings from the Bible. A squad of preachers led by John Knox not only cleansed the churches of idolatry and statues, but set up a system of parish ministers chosen by local congregations and assisted by elders who met in a general assembly. George Buchanan himself was the first moderator of the General Assembly. Now, Knox's Book of Discipline involved the setting up of schools in every parish in Scotland, so that people would be educated enough to read the Bible, which was the basis of the religion. And more importantly than anything else, it was Jesus Christ who was the head of the church in Scotland, not a king. The minister, Andrew Melville, explained this in simple terms to James VI when he said to him, "There's twa kings and twa kingdoms in Scotland. There is Christ Jesus the King and his kingdom the Kirk, whose subject King James the Sextus, and of whose kingdom not a king, nor a lord, nor a heed, but a member." Now, in the 17th and 18th centuries, we had something of a theocracy in Scotland, where the covenanted work of Reformation had to constantly be defended against encroachments from England and elsewhere. But it was a theocracy which valued intelligence and education, and where the nascent principles and practices of democracy were learned. As Burns himself wrote, The solemn league and covenant now brings a smile, now brings a tear, but sacred freedom too was theirs. If thou'rt a slave, indulge thy sneers. Now, James Barr MP wrote a detailed history of the Scottish Covenanters in 1946, bringing the story up to date in his own time, and included Thomas Muir and the political martyrs of the 1790s, as well as those who were executed and transported for their part in the 1820 Rising. We should never forget that the 1820 banner which was carried, Scotland Free or a Desert, was a direct copy of a 17th century Covenanting banner. James Barr was an ILP MP at a time when the ILP supported Home Rule for Scotland, and he presented a Scottish Home Rule Bill in the House of Commons. He was also a minister in the United Free Church, and for many people like him, Scottish democracy was inseparable from the history of the Church of Scotland, and we should be understanding that history. Now, as you all know, we had 10 Clydeside MPs elected to the Westminster Parliament in 1922, and the Glasgow crowd, which came to St Enoch Station to give them a good send-off, sang to them the Red Flag, but they also sang them Psalm 124, which is an old Covenanting song and anthem, a grateful song of deliverance. Now, some of you may know James Barr's grandson, Andrew Redmond Barr, who was part of the National Collective in 2014 and who has produced an illustrated declaration of Arbroath for this year, 2020. So the struggle of 1320 still continues into 2020. And if we're to win independence, we have to understand and take on board the continuum of Scottish history. Now, Mary has asked me to comment on the iconoclasm which has accompanied the Black Lives Matter campaign, and I do appreciate the reasons for the destruction, but my sympathies are always with the artist or sculptor whose work it is. The life of a sculptor is not an easy one. Commissions are thin on the ground and often subject to a competition, and you have to take the work when and where you can get it. You can't choose the subject, and the sponsor will have already chosen that for you, and the funder is always king. Now, the target in Edinburgh recently was the statue of Henry Dundas, Lord Melville, who stands on top of a huge pillar in St Andrew's Square in the heart of the new town. Slavery was not the worst of Dundas's crimes as far as Scotland was concerned, and maybe we should have got rid of him long ago on other grounds. Dundas is part of a cityscape which we as nationalists need to address, a cityscape which could be described as the Stonehenge of the Act of Union. Will we want to keep this after independence? Now, the novelist William McIlvaney described Edinburgh Newtown as the most English place in Scotland, and I quote, built to be a Hanoverian clearinghouse of the Scottish identity. The very street names declare what's happening, like an announcement of government policy in stone. You have George Street, Princess Street, Queen Street, with among them Hanover Street and Rose Street and Thistle Street. Any way you count it, the result is the defeat of Scottishness. This was an English identity superimposed on the capital of Scotland, an attempted psyche transplant. Scottishness may have been a way of life, but Britishness can be a career. You are not where you come from, but where you can go. And that's the message that the built Newtown gives to us. All street names are insidious and can be poisonous. When opening the new roads south from Stirling to Glasgow in the 1820s, the Stirling magistrates named the terraces which flank the Glasgow road, Pitt Street on the one hand and Melville Terrace on the other. Now, Pitt was the Tory Prime Minister of Britain, and Henry Dundas, Lord Melville, the man of the statue in St Andrew's Square, was the man who managed Scotland on Pitt's behalf. They might have well just put up a big sign saying, "Welcome to Tory Town on 4th. We behead radicals here, so behave yourselves." Before the Act of Union became law in 1707, there were protests and riots in virtually every Scottish town. So ask yourself, why does every Scottish town have a Union Street, and are we going to keep these street names after independence? And the same goes for George Streets. And why is George Square not been renamed Freedom Square now that we have an SNP government in place in the council? We really need to rethink the naming of the whole built environment before we take down any statues. But I think I've spoken long enough, and I don't want to outstay my welcome, so I'll just finish here and would be glad of your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening on YouTube, you can click the little bell and you get a reminder whenever we put out a new episode, which is every Friday.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website. And we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.
And we'll catch you later. Bye now.